and welcome back to my 5th vlog. I'm finally back. I haven't been vlogging as much as I was planning to because honestly, vlogging is so hard. So shout out to all the vloggers out there. Also, I've just been really busy with work and I just couldn't really find the energy to work on my vlogging. But it's Sunday night and I'm back. What I wanted to do today is talk about 5 books that I've read the last year that I really loved. I read a lot of books from all over the world. I love international writers, so they're from 5 different continents, these books. 4 are fiction, 1 is non-fiction. And I actually read over 70 books in my 2 years at HBS. So if you want to hear more about this, if you like this, please, as always, subscribe, but also comment, and I can do a lot more of this. So starting with my favorite book in the world, it's called Eva Luna by Isabel Allende. So my boyfriend gave me this book for my birthday last year, which was one day before we left for Chile to go to Patagonia. And he gave me this book because Isabel Allende is the most famous Chilean writer. So I read this book while I was in Chile. It was so much fun because she's so famous there. So wherever I brought this book, everyone was like, "Oh my God, are you reading her book?" They always asked me if I read it in Spanish, which unfortunately I didn't do. So the book is a fiction book. It's about 300 pages. It's a really fast read. I think I finished it within 48 hours. First of all, because it was so good, I didn't even want to talk to anyone. I only wanted to read. But also because Isabel's writing style is so easy. It's so smooth. So it's a very quick read, I'm sure, in any language. The book is about a girl, and her name is, of course, Eva Luna. And you basically follow her life from the day she is born until I think she's in about her 30s. And she grows up in Chile and she becomes an orphan at a really young age. And it's a beautiful book because she goes through so much hardship. She really goes from place to place. But this girl, Eva, from her perspective you read the book, is so positive, so optimistic, and she writes about all these things in such a light and funny way. So the book has everything. It has love, it has some sex, it has humor, it has pain, it's beautiful, it's sad, there's politics involved, there's adventures, there's nature, there's people, there's hate, there's everything in this book. That's all I want to say about it because really this is the best book I've written in my life, so I think everyone should read it. Moving on to the African continent with this book, Luanda's Labyrinth by Eduardo Agualusa. My boyfriend spent about 9 months working in Angola, where he got all into Portuguese and Angolese writers. This is an Angolese writer. The original is in Portuguese. I read the translation in Dutch. Also, this book is about 300 pages, and again, I think it's a pretty easy read, so you read through this in a couple of days. The book is about a male writer. I think he's in about his 40s or 50s, and he's basically describing his life in Luanda. And I think it's a beautiful way to get to know this country, this culture, and this crazy city. And it gives such a beautiful picture into the life all around Luanda. So it goes into poor neighborhoods, it goes into rich neighborhoods. It gives a very interesting and very detailed picture of life there. And there's also a lot of mystery and a lot of crazy things happening in this book where you're not really sure where the writer is going at with it. Is it kind of fantasy, or is there kind of a logical explanation for this all? So it's kind of mysterious, and it's also really poetic. So if you like reading poetry, there's so many paragraphs in this book that could easily be poems and that are so metaphorical. So if you're into that, you'll love it. If you are usually more of a non-fiction reader and you want something more tangible and more realistic, maybe this is not the book for you. So the next book is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. One of my classmates at HBS recommended me this book and I loved it. It's a tough read, I'll admit. It's over 500 pages, but it didn't bore me at all. Whereas usually as soon as the book is over 300 pages, I start complaining, I get impatient, I feel like they could have been way quicker at telling me the story. But this book, honestly, I will say I loved every single page. So this book tells a story of a Korean family that moves to Japan, and it runs all the way from 1910 until the 1980s, 1990s. And I think that's why it doesn't bore you at all. It just follows this family along for multiple generations. So it keeps kind of introducing new characters, new problems, new things that they're dealing with. So it keeps it really interesting. It tells all about the dynamics between Koreans and the Japanese. It's about the period when the North and South Korea were still one, and when they got segregated. And it's a part of history that honestly, growing up in the West, I know very, very little about. So it was really, really interesting learning so much about kind of modern day history while you don't feel like you're, studying at all. It was beautiful to read. What I will say, there's no humor in this book, so that's why I said it's a pretty tough read. I cried, I think, 3 times while reading this book, and I didn't think I laughed once. So it's beautiful, but again, you kind of have to be in the mood for something less light. Then, of course, I had to include a Dutch book, but the Dutch book that I read in the last year that I loved most, we've actually lent to someone. So I brought here a book by the same writer. So the book that I love is called Cod Hotel Europa by Ilja, Leonard, Pfeijffer. And the main person that he writes about is so much like him. He's a man, same age, his appearance is described to be the same. He's also a writer. So I was so confused when reading his books. I'm like, did this really happen? So honestly, I feel like it's a crossover between fiction and non-fiction. The book, I think, if I remember correctly, it's maybe around 400 pages, but it's again a really, really easy read. I do think it's a book that has everything in it. There's definitely some sex, maybe even some like kind of weird sex. So it's, at points, it's just, honestly, you feel kind of awkward reading it, but I think that's such a powerful tool when writers can do that to you. It's funny, but it's also really, really symbolic because it talks about the continent of Europe, and the main theme in the book is tourism. And it kind of explores themes around tourism in Venice, in the Netherlands, but also comparing kind of Europe to up and coming places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And I thought it was so symbolic, and I really agreed with the picture that was painted of my continent, so it was very close to heart. But it's also beautiful how he can write something so metaphorical and so meaningful in such a kind of brutally honest, very Dutch, very funny way. So definitely, definitely recommend. And then the last book is a non-fiction book from the US, and I picked Radical Candor. And it's written by Kim Scott. So I picked this book because I've been reading quite a lot of business literature. I've been doing so my whole life because I've always been interested in business, but then particularly since I've been at HBS. And I honestly can say I think this is the best written business book that I've read in my life. I was really interested in reading this because there's a ton of HBS cases that talk about this, and also my new employer really recommended I read this before I joined them, so that got me really curious, and while I read it I realized why everyone loves it so much. The main theme of the book is how to give good feedback, and it claims you should do so by being radically candid. And it also talks a lot about how giving good feedback and giving feedback often is key for organizations to thrive. Before I went to business school, I was working in consulting, and I think consulting firms are typically really, really good at giving feedback. So for most of the consultants seeing this, there might be less interesting learnings in here for you. But I think for everyone else, if you want to learn how the best companies in the world, it talks about Google, it talks about Apple, it talks about Twitter, all those really cool companies, how they incorporate feedback. I think this is a great read. It also talks about, how and when you should develop people, but also when it's time to fire people or let go of people. And I think that is one of the things that particularly here on mainland Europe, we're maybe not so good at. We're in really protectionist economies. We really, really hardly fire people. And I think from going to the US and going to HBS, I've definitely learned that there are situations where it's just better for everyone if the person that's not a right fit for the job goes and find a different job. And I think this book does such a good job at explaining why and when that is the case. And they really explain that it's not that the person is wrong, it's just that the job is wrong for the person. So I think it's a beautiful way of explaining that, so really recommend for anyone who's managing, whether it's one person or a huge team or a huge organization, Radical Candor. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please comment. If you have other tips for books you think I should read, please comment. And if you like this, I can do many more of these.